Hi everyone! I hope you're ready for the 10th video of the Human Biology course. Today, we are going to talk about evolution, some theories regarding evolution, and the way we classify and categorize species. So you might have wondered about the amount of species and living beings there are on this planet. The famous journal Nature estimated that number to be at around 8.7 million back in 2011. That is a lot of species. So your next question might be, how on earth can we categorize them all in order to be able to distinguish them or group them? And the answer to that is through a system called Taxonomic Hierarchy, created by Carolus Linnaeus in the 18th century. In this system, there is a hierarchy which goes like this: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Kingdom is the most broad step of the hierarchy, and species is the most specific step of the hierarchy. So let's explain each of these steps a bit further. Kingdom, as I mentioned, is the broadest level of the hierarchy, and it is divided into 5 groups: Animalia, Plantae, Fungi, Protista, and Monera. Animalia are most of the animals we know, mainly mammals, fish, reptiles, etc. In Animalia, all of the species are multicellular and eukaryotic. Plantae, as you can imagine, is the kingdom of plants. All the species in this kingdom are also multicellular and eukaryotic. Fungi is the kingdom of mushrooms, molds, yeasts, and more. These organisms are eukaryotic, but can either be multicellular or unicellular. Protista is the kingdom of all other species which are eukaryotic and are not in the other 3 kingdoms. These can be multi or unicellular, however, they are usually unicellular. A lot of parasitic species are in this kingdom. Finally, the Monera kingdom is composed of prokaryotic unicellular organisms, such as bacteria. Phylum is the next level, being a bit more specific than kingdom. This level is divided into 35 categories, which we will not go into detail. Class comes after, followed by order, family, genus, and species, with the latter being the most specific level. This level refers to a group of organisms which are similar in the way they reproduce, but also in their shape and form. Species can be divided into subspecies. So taking the example of human, the kingdom is Animalia, the phylum is Chordata, the class is Mammalia, the order is Primates, the family is Hominidae, the genus is Homo, and the species is Sapiens. The best way to think about it is by imagining saving a document on a folder in your computer. So within each folder you have another folder, and then inside that folder you have another one. Each new folder is more specific than the previous. So if you are saving an essay, for example, you might save it in C drive, and then school, A-levels, human biology, and then essays. C drive is the most general folder, where all your documents are saved, and then you get more specific with each folder until you get to the last one, where you keep your essays, and then obviously each essay will have a different name, differentiating it from the rest of the essays. That is exactly how taxonomic hierarchy works. So in order to locate that one essay, you need the whole pathway from C drive until the essay folder. The same happens with this system. If you want to locate, so to speak, a specific species, you need to know all about it, from its kingdom to its species and subspecies. So what is a species after all? A species is a group of organisms with similar traits which are able to reproduce to give fertile offspring. This last point is important, and there is a very easy example of why this is one of the characteristics of species. A mule, for example, is the result of crossing a male donkey with a female horse. However, mules are sterile, so they can't have their own offspring. and this is because donkeys and horses have a different amount of chromosomes, as they are from two different species. So obviously, genetics plays a part in the classification of species. But that wasn't always the case. When the system was first invented, humans did not know about genetics, and we did not have the equipment necessary to observe microscopic organisms. So at the time, species were classified based on features that were observable, such as appearance. With time and technology, we have improved upon this system, and now we are able to classify species based on DNA, microscopic examination, their biochemistry, anatomy, embryological development, immunological information, behavioral evidence, as well as observable features. Let's now talk about two very important theories which contributed to our knowledge of how species evolved through time. One of these theories was developed by Lamarck, and the other by Darwin. Let's start with Lamarck's theory. According to Lamarck, a trait which is used more and more often by a certain organism becomes bigger and stronger with time. Conversely, a trait which is not used starts to disappear over time. The traits which improve with time would then be passed on to the offspring. So take giraffes for an example. Imagine that in a certain territory where a family of giraffes lives, the trees where they feed from start becoming depleted of leaves on the lower branches. Through this theory, the giraffes would then start stretching for the top branches more and more, which would then mean that their necks would become longer with time, and then this trait would be passed on to their offspring. Unfortunately, this theory is not true. If it were, for example, hairy women who spend their lives shaving and waxing would only need to do it for a while, and then all that undesired hair would magically stop growing. Yes, that would be nice, wouldn't it? This theory would mean that simple organisms would simply stop existing, as they would keep improving and developing their traits, and as we know, that is not true. Now on to Darwin's theory. Darwin is the forefather of the science of evolution. He revolutionized this branch of science with his observations and with his famous theory of natural selection. According to Darwin, all species present natural variation. Now we know this is because of genetics, mainly the meiosis process we have talked about. So within the species of giraffes, some of them would possess short necks, and some medium-length necks, and some long necks. According to this theory, this natural variation is closely linked to likelihood of survival and reproduction. So the giraffes which were naturally long-necked would be more likely to survive as they would be able to reach the higher branches of the trees, whilst the short-necked giraffes would die off as they would not be able to reach the leaves and therefore starve. This way, when the long-necked giraffes reproduce, the trait of having long necks is perpetuated and passed on to the next generations. And this is how evolution occurred for every being. Through mutations in our DNA, more variability is introduced. This variability can either be good, in which case the trait is perpetuated and passed on through generations, or it can be bad, which then means the individuals with this trait are less likely to survive and reproduce, allowing the bad trait to die down. Now let's introduce the concept of population. The biology definition of population is the number of organisms which belong to the same species, who live in the same geographic area at the same time, and which can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So the same species can belong to multiple populations. For example, the humans living in London belong to the same species as the humans living in New York. However, they belong to different populations as they do not live in the same geographic area, although they can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Let's now talk about natural selection, which is a concept which is related to Darwin's theory of evolution. His theory stated that organisms with desirable traits would survive and reproduce more easily, and therefore pass those desirable traits to their offspring. The key words here are survive and reproduce, and this is where natural selection comes into play. Organisms with desirable traits will be preferred for reproduction, so a cheetah which runs faster and therefore can hunt more easily and provide food for his family will be a preferred mating individual when compared to a slower cheetah. When it comes to survival, if a gazelle is born with a problem in her legs and therefore cannot run, then that gazelle will soon be hunted without the chance to reproduce and pass on her leg problem. This is all called natural selection. Organisms adapt and change through time, with beneficial traits being perpetuated through the generations by being passed on through their genes, whilst bad traits will disappear over time. Another factor at play in natural selection is competition. You've probably seen those funky-looking birds singing special mating songs or doing mating dances for their prospective partners. This is competition. Birds which have brighter colors or interesting patterns, an enticing song or a dance which is preferred by their female counterparts will be chosen for mating, which then means those traits are passed on. So this theory was then developed to explain the origin of new species, called speciation. This process usually happens when a population is geographically separated, for example by a river, a mountain, etc. When a population is divided, two new populations form, as they live in different geographic areas. These populations then start to adapt to their own environment, which means that genetic changes start to occur, which over time could give rise to two new species. And this is how all the species we know were formed, from a common ancestor which spread to different locations, which then led to the organisms developing new traits and phenotypes to adjust to their new environments. This then led to genetic differences between the populations, and eventually, when those genetic differences are big enough, then these populations are considered to be different species with different traits. This speciation process is corroborated by the numerous fossil records found through time. From these records, it is possible to see the evolution of certain traits and compare them with similar organisms from different periods. And that is the end of the 10th video of the Human Biology course. Have a great week, and I will see you next week for the 11th video. See you then!